Marcus stared at the photograph until his vision blurred, the edges of the storage unit seeming to close in around him. The little boy in the picture had his same dark eyes, the same stubborn cowlick that Sophia had inherited, but everything else was wrong. The Superman t-shirt was too small, the khaki shorts too clean for a kid who supposedly lived in the group home his adoptive parents had described. And the woman's hand resting on his shoulder, gentle, protective, belonged to someone who looked nothing like the social workers he remembered. He flipped the photo over with trembling fingers. Written in faded blue ink, Miguel, age 7, Casa Esperanza, Fresno, 1996. Miguel, not Marcus. The chemical smell of the storage unit made his head spin, or maybe it was the slow dissolution of everything he thought he knew about himself. He set the photograph aside and reached for another file, this one labeled Transport, November 1996. Inside, a stack of documents that read like a shipping manifest, but instead of cargo, they listed children, names, ages, destinations. And there, halfway down the page, Miguel Rivera, 7, Fresno to Bakersfield. Placement confirmed with Rivera family. Placement. Like he was furniture being delivered. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor who watched Sophia after school. Sophia asking when Daddy comes home. Made her a snack, but she keeps checking the window. The normalcy of it felt like a slap. Here he was, crouched in a storage unit that reeked of meth and secrets, while his daughter waited for him in their cramped apartment, probably working on homework at their kitchen table with the wobbly leg. She had no idea that her father might not even be who he claimed to be. He typed back quickly, "On my way soon. Tell her I'm working on something for Christmas." It wasn't entirely a lie. He'd come here hoping to find electronics or tools he could flip for gift money. Instead, he'd found evidence that his entire life was built on forged documents and false identities. The banker's boxes stretched before him like an accusation. There had to be 30 or 40 files, each one representing a child who'd vanished from official records only to reappear somewhere else with new names, new families. Some of the photographs were recent, kids who would be teenagers now, if they were still alive. Others were yellowed and cracked, dating back to the early 2000s. Ramon Delgado's operation, whatever it was, had been running for years. Marcus pulled out his phone again and searched for Ramon Delgado Bakersfield. The obituary was brief. Ramon El Cuervo Delgado, 58, died September 15, 2023, while serving a 15-year sentence for methamphetamine distribution at Kern Valley State Prison. No services planned. Below that, a mugshot from his arrest in 2019, a weathered face with prison tattoos and dead eyes that seemed to stare directly through the camera. But the arrest report mentioned only drug charges. Nothing about children. Nothing about the systematic documentation of missing persons that filled these boxes like a librarian's fever dream. Marcus checked his watch. 4:30. Sophia would be getting anxious, and he still had to figure out how to get all this evidence back to his truck without drawing attention. The other bidders had long since departed with their own treasures. A woman had paid $200 for a unit full of furniture, while a dealer in vintage electronics had walked away with 3 boxes of old stereo equipment. He'd been the only one desperate enough to bid on the unit that smelled like a crime scene. The photograph of himself seemed to mock him from where he'd left it on top of the nearest box. 7-year-old Miguel smiled at the camera with gap-toothed innocence, unaware that his future self would discover this image while scrounging for Christmas money in a storage facility that felt like purgatory. Marcus tried to remember anything from before his placement with the Rivera family. His adoptive parents, both gone now, his father from a heart attack 3 years ago, his mother from cancer just last year, had always been vague about his early childhood. "You came to us from a bad situation," Maria Rivera used to say. "All that matters is you're ours now." But according to these documents, the bad situation had been Casa Esperanza, a children's home in Fresno that he'd never heard of. And his adoptive parents hadn't rescued him. They'd received him like a package, complete with fabricated paperwork that erased Miguel and created Marcus. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him freeze. Through the gap under the storage unit's door, he could see work boots approaching. The facility manager probably, making his evening rounds. Marcus quickly shoved the photograph and transport documents into his jacket pocket, then grabbed the nearest banker's box. Whatever was in these files, he couldn't leave them here. Too many children's faces stared up at him from the scattered folders, too many families who probably still wondered what had happened to their missing sons and daughters. He had to get this evidence home and figure out what to do with it. More importantly, he had to figure out what to do with the truth about himself. The work boots passed by without stopping, their rhythms steady and uninterested. Marcus waited until the footsteps faded before exhaling the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He needed to move fast. The facility would close soon, and explaining why he was still here at sunset with boxes of what looked like stolen documents wasn't a conversation he wanted to have. He loaded the banker's boxes into his truck, 3 at a time, each trip feeling like a small betrayal of the life he'd built. By the time he finished, his 2015 Ford was weighed down with evidence of crimes he didn't understand, committed by a dead man whose storage unit now belonged to him for 30 days, assuming he kept paying the monthly fee he couldn't afford. The drive home through Bakersfield's east side took him past the usual landmarks of his ordinary world. The Carl's Jr., where Sophia insisted they eat every Friday when his unemployment check came in. The AutoZone, where he'd applied for work twice without getting a call back. The elementary school where his daughter attended 3rd grade and where the other parents knew him as the guy who showed up to pick up in oil-stained jeans because he'd been working on cars in their apartment complex parking lot, trying to earn enough cash to keep the lights on. None of those people knew Miguel. They knew Marcus Rivera, the single dad who'd been laid off from Thermal Industries 6 months ago when the machine shop downsized. Marcus, who coached Sophia's soccer team on Saturdays and helped with homework every night at their kitchen table. Marcus, who made pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings and who still checked under her bed for monsters, even though she claimed she was too old for such things. But Miguel was a stranger who lived in a photograph with a woman whose face Marcus couldn't place, no matter how hard he tried to excavate his earliest memories. He pulled into the parking lot of Sunrise Gardens Apartments, a name that had always struck him as optimistic for a complex where half the units had bars on the windows and the other half probably should have. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of Building C, the one with the broken security gate and the perpetual smell of Mrs. Chen's cooking drifting through the thin walls. Sophia's face appeared in their living room window before he'd even turned off the engine. She waved with the enthusiastic energy of an 8-year-old who'd been counting the minutes until her father returned, and Marcus felt something crack in his chest. Whatever secrets these documents contained, whatever lies his life had been built on, Sophia was real. Sophia was his. She was the one pure thing in his world, and she needed him to be Marcus Rivera, not Miguel, not some lost boy with a fabricated identity, but the father who read her bedtime stories and who promised her that Christmas would be special this year, even if they had to be creative about it. He climbed the stairs with one banker's box under his arm, leaving the rest hidden under a tarp in his truck bed. Mrs. Patterson opened her door as he reached the landing. She always seemed to have radar for his arrival. "That girl's been asking about you every 10 minutes, she said. But her tone was warm. Mrs. Patterson had lived in the complex longer than anyone, and she'd appointed herself the unofficial grandmother to every kid in the building. "Said you were working on a Christmas surprise," something like that. Marcus managed a smile that felt like plastic. "Thanks for watching her, Mrs. Patterson. I owe you. You don't owe me nothing, honey. That's what neighbors do." If only the rest of the world operated on Mrs. Patterson's simple principles. Marcus let himself into the apartment, setting the box down by the door and hoping Sophia wouldn't ask what was inside. She launched herself at him before he'd fully crossed the threshold, wrapping her arms around his waist with the fierce affection that had sustained him through every difficult moment since her mother died 4 years ago. Lucia had been the stable one, the one with the steady job and the 5-year plan. After the cancer took her, Marcus had promised himself he'd be enough for Sophia, that he'd figure out how to be both parents rolled into one imperfect package. "Did you find treasure?" Sophia asked, pulling back to study his face with the intensity she'd inherited from her mother. "You look weird. Just tired, Mia. And maybe a little treasure. We'll see." She accepted this answer with the trust that children give to the adults who anchor their world. Marcus helped her with math homework while dinner heated in the microwave, leftover spaghetti from 2 nights ago, stretched with extra sauce and hope. They ate while she told him about her day, the substitute teacher who let them have extra recess, the boy in her class who brought a pet lizard for show and tell, the Christmas wish list she was revising for the 3rd time this week. Normal. Everything achingly, preciously normal. But the banker's box sat by the door like a bomb with a timer he couldn't see, counting down to the moment when everything ordinary about their life would disappear forever. After Sophia fell asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table staring at the banker's box. The apartment was quiet except for the familiar sounds of their neighbors, the Garcias' television murmuring through the wall, Mr. Thompson's dog barking at shadows in the courtyard below. Sophia's breathing came steady and soft from her bedroom, the rhythm that had become Marcus's lullaby over the past 4 years. He opened the box. The first file contained documents for a girl named Isabella Santos, age 6 when she disappeared from a foster home in Modesto in 2018. The photograph showed a child with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, but paper-clipped to the back was a driver's license from 2023. Isabella Mendez, now 21, living in Phoenix. Different last name, different city, but the same distinctive birthmark on her left cheek. The second file belonged to David Chen, missing from Sacramento in 2015, age 4 in his disappearance photo, but the accompanying documents showed him enrolled in high school in Las Vegas under the name Daniel Chavez, his Asian features unchanged, but his entire history rewritten. Marcus's hands moved mechanically through the files, each one revealing the same impossible pattern. Children who vanished from the system only to resurface years later with new identities, new families, new lives. Some of the documentation was crude, obviously forged birth certificates and social security cards, but others looked official enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the deception. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop looking through those files if you know what's good for you." Marcus dropped the phone like it had burned him. He checked the locks on the front door, then moved to the window and peered through the blinds at the parking lot. His truck sat where he'd left it, undisturbed, but shadows moved between the buildings in ways that might have been people, or might have been his imagination painting threats in the darkness. The phone buzzed again. "We know where you live. We know about Sophia." This time Marcus's blood turned to ice water. He grabbed the phone and typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. Friends of Ramon. He had partners. "We've been watching the storage unit since he died. You picked the wrong box, Marcus. Or should I say Miguel?" The use of both names felt like a physical blow. Whoever was texting him knew about the photograph, knew about the documents, knew exactly what Marcus had discovered. And they'd mentioned Sophia by name. Marcus closed the file and grabbed his car keys. He had to get the remaining boxes from his truck before whoever was watching decided to take them back by force. But as he reached for the door, another text arrived. "Leave the boxes where they are. Come outside. Alone. We need to talk." Through the window, Marcus could see a black SUV parked across the street that hadn't been there when he'd come home. 2 figures sat in the front seats, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. As he watched, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, wearing a baseball cap and dark jacket that made him blend into the night. Marcus's mind raced through his options. He could call the police, but what would he tell them? That he'd bought a storage unit full of documents that suggested a massive child trafficking operation, and now someone was threatening him. The cops would want to see the evidence, which would mean admitting he'd removed it from the storage facility. And if these people really were Ramon's partners, involving law enforcement might put Sophia in more danger, not less. He could run, Pack Sophia up right now, drive through the night, and disappear somewhere these people couldn't find them. But his truck was nearly empty, they had nowhere to go, and he didn't even know who he was running from or how far their reach extended. Or he could go downstairs and face whatever waited for him in that SUV. The man on the street wasn't approaching the building, just standing there, patient as death, waiting for Marcus to make his choice. Behind him, Sophia's breathing continued its steady rhythm, the sound of innocence that depended on him to keep it safe. Marcus looked at the open file on his table, at Isabella's smiling face and the documentation of her stolen childhood. Somewhere, other children were living with fabricated identities, raised by families who might not even know the truth. Somewhere, parents were still searching for sons and daughters who'd been erased from existence and given new names, new lives. Just like Miguel had become Marcus. His phone buzzed one final time, 5 minutes. "Then we come up." Marcus stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary debris of single parenthood. Sophia's homework on the counter, her cereal bowl in the sink, the grocery list magneted to the refrigerator that included items he couldn't afford but hoped for anyway. Everything normal, everything at risk. The choice was simple and impossible. Protect his daughter's world by surrendering the evidence, or risk everything to save children whose faces stared up at him from files scattered across his kitchen table. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Marcus's hand froze on the doorknob as the weight of what he was about to do crashed over him. Behind the thin apartment door, Sophia slept peacefully, trusting that her father would protect her from whatever monsters lurked in the darkness. But stepping outside meant facing monsters that were very real, and he had no idea if he'd live through the conversation waiting for him in that black SUV. He pulled his hand back and leaned against the doorframe, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't some action movie where the hero charged into danger and emerged victorious through sheer determination. This was real life, where single fathers who stumbled onto criminal conspiracies usually just disappeared, leaving their 8-year-old daughters to wonder why Daddy never came home. The smart move was obvious: walk away. Pretend he'd never opened those files, never seen that photograph of Miguel, never learned that his entire identity might be built on lies. Take the few electronics he'd spotted in the storage unit, sell them for Christmas money, and forget everything else. Sophia needed a living father more than the world needed another dead hero. But Isabella Santos's face stared up at him from the open file on the kitchen table. 6 years old when she vanished, now 21 and living under a stolen name. How many years had her real parents searched for her? How many nights had they lain awake wondering if their daughter was safe, if she remembered them, if she was even still alive? Marcus thought about his own adoptive parents, Maria and Roberto Rivera, both gone now but who had loved him fiercely despite the mysterious circumstances of his arrival. They'd given him everything they could: a name, a home, a chance at a normal life. But what if they'd been unwitting participants in something horrible? What if some other family had spent decades searching for Miguel, never knowing he'd become Marcus, and moved just 2 hours south to Bakersfield? His phone lit up with another message: 4 minutes. The countdown felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Every second he delayed was another second these people had to get impatient, to decide that coming upstairs might be easier than waiting. Marcus pressed his ear to the door, listening for footsteps in the hallway, but heard only the familiar sounds of the apartment complex settling into night. He looked towards Sophia's bedroom, where her door stood slightly ajar the way she liked it, not quite closed, but enough privacy to feel grown up. Inside that room was everything that mattered to him: the drawings she'd taped to her walls, the stuffed elephant she'd owned since she was 3, the little girl who'd already lost her mother and who trusted Marcus to keep her world safe and predictable. What right did he have to risk that for strangers? Isabella Santos was 21 now, an adult who'd survived whatever had happened to her, who'd built a life in Phoenix under a different name. David Chen had made it to high school in Las Vegas. These weren't children who needed rescuing anymore. They were adults who might not even want their carefully constructed, new lives destroyed by the revelation of their stolen identities. Maybe the kindest thing would be to let sleeping ghosts lie. But even as Marcus tried to convince himself, he knew it was cowardice talking. Those files contained dozens of cases spanning 15 years. Some of the children would be adults now, yes, but others were recent disappearances. Kids who might still be young enough to remember their real families, to be reunited with parents who'd never stopped searching. And then there were the families on the other side of the equation. Parents like himself, who'd adopted children through what they believed were legitimate channels, never knowing their sons and daughters had been stolen from other homes. How many loving families were living with the truth bomb that their entire relationship was built on trafficking and forged documents? Marcus wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and tried to think clearly. The people in that SUV knew who he was, knew where he lived, knew about Sophia. Running wasn't really an option. They'd already found him once, and his finances couldn't support disappearing with an 8-year-old who needed school and stability and her own bedroom with drawings on the walls. But cooperation might not guarantee safety either. If Ramon's partners were willing to threaten a child to recover those documents, what would stop them from eliminating witnesses once they had what they wanted? Dead men couldn't testify about criminal conspiracies, and missing persons cases in Bakersfield's rougher neighborhoods rarely generated sustained police attention. The phone buzzed. 3 minutes. Don't make us wait. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to channel the steady presence his adoptive father had always projected in moments of crisis. Roberto Rivera had been a mechanic who fixed problems methodically, step by step, never rushing but never hesitating when action was required. "When you don't know what to do, mijo," he used to say, "start by protecting what matters most." Sophia mattered most. Everything else was just details. Marcus opened his eyes and reached for the doorknob again, his decision crystallizing into something that felt less like courage and more like the terrible mathematics of survival. The doorknob turned under Marcus's grip with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He stepped into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid closing. There would be no going back now, not to the illusion of safety, not to the comfortable lies that had shaped his identity, not to the simple life where his biggest worry was finding enough work to pay rent. His footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as he descended the stairs, each step taking him further from Sophia's sleeping form and deeper into a world he didn't understand. The familiar sounds of the apartment complex, Mrs. Garcia's late-night television, the hum of the ice machine on the second floor, faded behind him like the last notes of a lullaby. By the time he reached the main entrance, even those comforting noises had been swallowed by the weight of what he was walking toward. The night air hit his face like a slap, carrying the scent of cooling asphalt and the distant smell of grease from the 24-hour diner on Chester Avenue. The black SUV sat exactly where he'd seen it from his window, its engine running, exhaust visible in the November chill. The man who'd emerged earlier stood beside the driver's door, his face still hidden in shadow, but his posture radiating the kind of patience that spoke of experience with situations like this. Marcus forced himself to walk steadily across the parking lot, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets to hide their trembling. Each step felt like crossing a minefield. One wrong move, one sign of panic or defiance, and everything could explode. The distance between his building and the street had never seemed so vast, yet simultaneously he wished it could stretch on forever, postponing the moment when he'd have to face whatever waited for him. "Smart choice," the man said, as Marcus approached. His voice carried a slight accent. Mexican, Marcus thought, but softened by years in California. "Though you took your time getting here." "I have an 8-year-old daughter sleeping upstairs," Marcus replied, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Forgive me if I needed a moment to think about what happens to her if this conversation goes badly." The man stepped closer, and Marcus could finally make out his features in the glow of the streetlight. Late 40s, weathered face marked by old acne scars, eyes that had seen too much but hadn't gone dead yet. Not what Marcus had expected from Ramon's partner. This looked like someone's tired uncle, not a criminal mastermind. "Nothing happens to your daughter if you're reasonable," the man said. "We're not animals. We're businessmen dealing with a business problem. The business of stealing children? The business of giving children better lives than the system ever would have." The man's tone remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "Do you think Isabella Santos was better off in that foster home where her guardian was selling her food stamps for drug money?" David Chen's parents died in a car accident. He was headed for a group home where kids age out at 18 with nothing but trauma and a high school diploma, if they're lucky. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The casual way this man spoke about the stolen children, the rationalization that made kidnapping sound like charity work. It revealed a level of organized delusion that was somehow more terrifying than simple greed would have been. "And what about Miguel?" Marcus asked. "What better life was he getting?" For the first time, the man's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been genuine regret. That was different. That was Ramon's personal project, and it went wrong. Your birth parents, they weren't supposed to die. The plan was reunification after they cleaned up their act. But overdoses don't follow anyone's timeline. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His birth parents had been drug addicts. They'd died while he was being temporarily relocated. His entire identity, his adoption by the Riveras, his life in Bakersfield, all of it built on a trafficking operation that had improvised when their original plan fell apart. "The Riveras never knew," the man continued, watching Marcus's face carefully. "They thought they were dealing with a legitimate adoption agency. Good people, your adoptive parents. They loved you, raised you right. Ramon made sure of that. How generous of him." The sarcasm came out sharper than Marcus had intended. "It was, actually. Ramon could have dumped you back into the system when your birth parents died, but he didn't. He made sure you ended up somewhere safe, with people who wanted a son. That's more than most kids in the system ever get." Marcus stared at this stranger who spoke about his life like it was a case file, who discussed trafficking children as if it were a social service. Behind him, his apartment building rose into the darkness, Sophia still sleeping peacefully in the bedroom where he'd read her stories just hours ago. Ahead of him stretched a path into questions that had no safe answers. There was no going back to ignorance. The threshold had been crossed. The man gestured toward the SUV's open passenger door. "Get in. We need to go somewhere more private to finish this conversation." "I'm not getting in that car." Marcus planted his feet on the asphalt, every instinct screaming against climbing into a vehicle controlled by people who traffic children. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it here. You don't understand the situation you're in." The man's voice remained calm, but something harder crept into his tone. "This isn't a negotiation between equals. You have something that belongs to us. We're being polite about getting it back, but politeness has limits." Marcus felt the weight of his phone in his pocket, not as a lifeline, but as a reminder of how easily these people had found him. They knew his address, his daughter's name, probably his work history and social security number. Running or hiding wasn't an option when the enemy had that much information. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. "Someone who's been cleaning up Ramon's messes for 20 years. He kept records he shouldn't have kept, took souvenirs when he should have destroyed evidence. We've been trying to locate those files since he died, and now you want them back. We want them gone, burned, forgotten. Ramon's dead, the operation's been shut down for months, and those children are adults now with lives they've built. Dragging up the past helps nobody." A car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping across them before disappearing around the corner. In that brief moment of illumination, Marcus caught sight of the SUV's interior, another man in the passenger seat, and what looked like a third figure in the back. He was outnumbered and outgunned, standing in a parking lot at midnight with nothing but his determination to protect Sophia. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. "Bad things. To you, to your daughter, to any family members these people might track down while looking for justice that doesn't exist anymore." You think Isabella Santos wants her life in Phoenix destroyed? You think her adoptive family wants to learn they've been living a lie for 15 years? The man pulled out his own phone and showed Marcus a photograph. Isabella, recognizably older now, standing outside what looked like a college campus with books in her arms and a genuine smile on her face. She looked happy, adjusted, normal. She's studying to be a teacher, the man continued. Engaged to a nice boy from Tempe. Her adoptive parents put her through private school, paid for her college, gave her everything. You want to destroy that because of something that happened when she was 6 years old? Marcus stared at the photograph, his certainty wavering. The little girl from the files had become a woman with a life, relationships, a future she'd built on the foundation of her stolen identity. Was exposing the truth worth destroying that happiness? How many others are there? Marcus asked. Enough that you can't save them all, and most of them don't want saving. Most isn't all. The man's expression hardened. You're not thinking this through. Even if you went to the police, what exactly would you tell them? That you bought stolen property and found files suggesting crimes from decades ago? They'd arrest you for receiving stolen goods and confiscate everything anyway. Marcus felt the truth of that statement like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the moral implications that he hadn't considered the legal ones. Possession of those documents might make him an accessory to whatever crimes they represented. There's another problem, the man continued. Ramon's operation didn't work in isolation. Judges, social workers, adoption agencies, people who made sure the paperwork looked legitimate and the right signatures appeared in the right places. Those people are still alive, still in positions of power. You think they'll let their careers be destroyed by some unemployed mechanic with a hero complex? The scope of what Marcus was up against began to crystallize. This wasn't just about Ramon and his criminal partners. It was about an entire network of corruption that had protected this operation for years. Going up against that with nothing but moral outrage and a collection of files felt like charging a tank with a water gun. So, what do you want from me? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Bring us everything. The files, any copies you might have made, any evidence you removed from that storage unit. In return, we disappear and you never hear from us again. You go back to your life, raise your daughter, forget any of this ever happened, and if I don't... The man's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Then you learn exactly how far our reach extends. And your daughter learns what it's like to grow up without a father. The threat hung in the November air between them, as real and dangerous as a loaded gun. Marcus looked up at his apartment building, at the window where Sophia slept, and realized he was completely out of his depth. But somewhere in the terror, a strange clarity began to emerge. These people were scared too, scared enough to threaten him instead of simply taking what they wanted. That meant he had something they needed, something that gave him leverage he didn't fully understand yet. Marcus stood frozen in the parking lot, the threat echoing in his mind like a death knell. The man waited patiently, hands clasped behind his back, while the SUV's engine continued its low rumble. 3 against 1, with Sophia sleeping defenseless upstairs. The mathematics of the situation couldn't be clearer. But clarity brought an unexpected gift, the realization that fear, once acknowledged, could be managed. Marcus had spent years in machine shops where one wrong move could cost fingers or worse. He'd learned to work methodically, even when adrenaline screamed at him to rush. This was just another kind of dangerous machinery. I need time, Marcus said finally, to gather everything, make sure I haven't missed anything. How much time? 24 hours. The man checked his watch. 12. We meet tomorrow night, same time, same place. You bring everything, originals, copies, anything you might have photographed or scanned. We verify it's complete, then you walk away. Marcus nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead to what those 12 hours might hold. How do I know you'll keep your word about leaving us alone? Because we're not monsters, Mr. Rivera. We're survivors. Ramon's death created a problem that needs to be contained, nothing more. Once that problem is solved, We have no interest in a struggling father in Bakersfield." The man started toward the SUV, then paused. "One more thing. Don't try to be clever. Don't make copies thinking you'll have insurance. Don't reach out to police or journalists or anyone else who might seem helpful. We have people watching, and we'll know." Marcus felt the weight of invisible eyes settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. People watching where? Everywhere that matters. Your daughter's school, your apartment building, the places where you look for work. The man's smile was almost paternal. "We've been doing this for a long time, Marcus. Longer than you've been alive, technically." The SUV doors slammed shut with the finality of coffin lids. Marcus watched the vehicle pull away from the curb and disappear into the maze of Bakersfield's late-night traffic, leaving him alone under the streetlight with nothing but the echo of threats and the crushing weight of impossible choices. He turned back toward his apartment building, but instead of climbing the stairs, he found himself walking to the small playground behind the complex. The swings hung motionless in the still air, their chains creaking softly in the breeze. He sat on one of the benches and pulled out his phone. No signal bars. Marcus stared at the dead screen, then laughed, a short, bitter sound that died quickly in the night air. Of course, they'd probably been jamming his phone since the moment he walked outside. These people were professionals, and he was an amateur stumbling through their world with nothing but good intentions and a file box full of evidence he barely understood. The smart play was obvious. Gather the files, hand them over, and pray these people kept their word about disappearing. Sophia would never have to know her father had briefly considered becoming a hero. She'd grow up safe, normal, ignorant of the darkness that had shaped her family's history. But sitting on that bench, staring up at his apartment window, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Isabella Santos's 6-year-old face from the missing person report, or David Chen's school photo, all gap-toothed smile and hopeful eyes, or his own 7-year-old self, Miguel, whose death certificate Ramon had apparently forged to cover the tracks of his transformation into Marcus Rivera. How many other families were living with the same hidden wounds? Parents who'd never stopped searching for children who'd been given new names and new lives. Adoptive families who'd unknowingly built their happiness on stolen foundations. Adults walking through the world unaware that someone, somewhere, still looked for them. Marcus thought about his adoptive father's hands. Roberto's thick fingers that could rebuild an engine or bandage a scraped knee with equal skill. Those hands had held Marcus when nightmares woke him in the early years, had taught him to tie shoes and throw a baseball and change oil. Roberto had died believing Marcus was his son in every way that mattered, never knowing their relationship was built on trafficking and forged documents. Would the truth have mattered to Roberto? Marcus thought not. Love was love, regardless of its origins. But the choice to know or not know should have been Roberto's to make, not Ramon's. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't really about saving strangers. It was about the right to truth, to choice, to the messy complexity of real life instead of the sanitized fiction that trafficking operations provided. Those people in the SUV weren't offering protection. They were selling continued slavery to comfortable lies. Marcus stood up from the bench, his decision crystallizing into something that felt less like courage and more like the terrible necessity of being human in a world that often punished humanity. 12 hours. He had 12 hours to figure out how to protect his daughter while refusing to abandon the children in those files, including the 7-year-old boy named Miguel, who died on paper so Marcus could live. Marcus climbed the stairs to his apartment with legs that felt like concrete, each step a monumental effort against the weight of what he'd just committed himself to. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical lullaby while his mind raced through scenarios that all ended badly. 12 hours to find a way out of an impossible situation. 12 hours to protect Sophia from consequences he couldn't predict or control. 12 hours to figure out how to be both father and hero when those roles seemed mutually exclusive. He slipped inside the apartment and stood in the doorway to Sophia's room, watching her sleep. She'd kicked off her blankets again, one small foot dangling over the edge of the mattress. Her breathing was deep and even, the sound of perfect trust in a world she believed was safe because her father made it so. What would happen to her if he disappeared? The man in the parking lot had been clear about the stakes, cooperation or consequences. But Marcus had seen enough missing person reports in those files to know that disappearing could mean many things, not all of them fatal. Ramon's network had been sophisticated enough to give stolen children new identities and loving homes. They could probably do the same thing in reverse. The thought of Sophia waking up in some foster home, told that her father had abandoned her, was worse than imagining his own death. At least if he died, she'd know he'd loved her until the end. But if they made him vanish and fed her lies about why he'd left, that would be its own kind of murder. Marcus moved to his bedroom and pulled out the file box, setting it on his small desk beside Sophia's homework and the stack of job applications he'd been filling out just yesterday. Yesterday, when his biggest worry had been whether he'd find work before Christmas, when his greatest fear was disappointing his daughter with second-hand presents from Goodwill. The files stared back at him, innocent manila folders that contained enough explosive truth to destroy dozens of lives. Isabella Santos, David Chen, Christina Park, Timothy Rodriguez, children who'd been stolen from one life and given another, who'd grown up believing comfortable lies about their origins. And somewhere out there were birth families who'd never stopped searching. Marcus thought about his own birth parents, dead from overdoses, while he played with toys in the Rivera household, unaware that he'd been renamed and relocated. Had they loved him before the drugs took over? Had they fought to get clean, believing he'd be returned to them once they proved worthy? He'd never know now. Ramon had made sure of that. Marcus opened his laptop, an ancient machine that wheezed to life with the enthusiasm of a dying car engine. The screen flickered blue, then stabilized into a desktop cluttered with Sophia's educational games and his resume documents. He opened a web browser and stared at the blinking cursor in the search bar. What exactly was he planning to do? Upload the files to social media and hope viral outrage would protect him? Send everything to news stations and pray some journalist would care enough about old crimes to investigate? Contact the FBI and trust that federal agents wouldn't be part of whatever network had protected Ramon for decades? Every option felt like signing his own death warrant. Marcus typed child trafficking whistleblower protection into the search bar, then deleted it without hitting enter. They'd said they were watching, and that probably included monitoring his internet activity. He was trapped in his own home, surrounded by invisible surveillance, playing a game whose rules he didn't understand against opponents who'd been perfecting their strategy for decades. A sound from Sophia's room made him freeze, a small whimper that meant she was having another nightmare. Marcus rushed to her doorway and found her thrashing against her pillow, caught in whatever dream terror was chasing her through sleep. He sat on the edge of her bed and gently stroked her hair until the nightmare released its grip. "Daddy?" she mumbled, not quite awake. "I'm here, baby. You're safe." Sophia's breathing settled back into sleep's rhythm, but Marcus remained beside her bed, watching over her in the darkness. This was what mattered, this moment, this child, this responsibility that transcended everything else. Whatever noble impulses were driving him to protect strangers, they couldn't justify endangering the one person who depended on him completely. But as he sat there in the quiet apartment, surrounded by the ordinary debris of their ordinary life, Sophia's scattered toys, his work boots by the door, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, Marcus realized that ordinary was exactly what those files represented. Ordinary children who deserved ordinary childhoods with their birth families. Ordinary parents who deserved the chance to fight for their children instead of having them stolen away by people who thought they knew better. The clock on Sophia's nightstand glowed 1:17 a.m., less than 11 hours remaining until he had to make the choice that would define the rest of their lives. Less than 11 hours to find a way to be both the father Sophia needed and the man his conscience demanded he become. Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead and returned to the files, knowing that sleep was no longer an option. The ordeal had truly begun. Marcus spread the files across his kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. Each folder represented a choice between Sophia's safety and his conscience, between comfortable lies and dangerous truths. The clock on the microwave ticked past 2 a.m., marking another hour lost to an impossible puzzle. He'd tried everything he could think of in the cramped confines of his apartment, writing letters to journalists, then deleting them when he realized his internet was probably monitored, composing emails to FBI field offices, then closing the browser when paranoia whispered that federal agents might be part of the network. Every potential solution crumbled under the weight of his own inexperience and the enemy's apparent omnipresence. The worst part was the growing certainty that he was playing their game by their rules. They'd given him exactly enough time to exhaust his options, to feel the walls closing in, to arrive at surrender through his own desperate calculations. 12 hours wasn't an arbitrary deadline. It was precisely calibrated to break him. Marcus opened Isabella Santos's file again, staring at the progression from 6-year-old victim to college-bound young woman. She looked genuinely happy in the surveillance photo they'd shown him, surrounded by the life her adoptive parents had built for her. Maybe the man in the parking lot was right. Maybe some stolen children were better left stolen. But that photograph raised questions that made his stomach clench. How had they gotten such a recent picture? How long had they been watching Isabella, David Chen, and the others? The network wasn't just covering up old crimes. They were actively monitoring the victims, maintaining surveillance years after the trafficking had ended, which meant they'd probably been watching him too, long before he'd bought that storage unit. The realization hit him like ice water. Marcus grabbed his laptop and pulled up his bank records, searching through months of transactions with new eyes. There, November 15th, the day before the storage auction, a cash withdrawal for exactly $300 from an ATM he never used, in a part of town he rarely visited. He didn't remember making that withdrawal. Marcus frantically scrolled through more records, finding irregularities that had seemed insignificant at the time. A gas station charge near the storage facility the week before the auction. A fast food purchase on a day he'd sworn he'd packed lunch for Sophia. Small transactions, perfectly normal individually, but together they painted a picture of surveillance and manipulation that made his blood freeze. They hadn't been watching him since the auction. They'd been orchestrating his participation in it. The storage unit hadn't been abandoned. It had been bait. Ramon's death in prison, the unpaid fees, the conveniently timed auction, Marcus's mysterious knowledge of when and where to bid, all of it had been orchestrated to put those files in his hands. But why? What possible benefit could they gain from exposing their own crimes? Marcus thought about the man's words in the parking lot. Ramon's death created a problem that needs to be contained. Not the files themselves, but something about Ramon's death, something that required a specific kind of solution, a particular type of fall guy. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Check your daughter's backpack. Marcus's hands trembled as he crept back to Sophia's room and carefully lifted her school bag from beside the bed. Inside, tucked between her math homework and reading journal, was a manila envelope he'd never seen before. The envelope contained a single document, a police report dated 3 days ago filed by Detective Sarah Chen of the Bakersfield Police Department. The report detailed suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of Ramon Delgado in state prison, specifically allegations from a cellmate that Ramon had been murdered to prevent him from revealing the location of evidence related to historical child trafficking cases. Detective Chen was requesting permission to investigate Ramon's storage facilities and known associates. The report listed Marcus Rivera as a person of interest, someone who'd been observed conducting surveillance of the storage facility where Ramon had allegedly hidden evidence. Marcus read the report 3 times before the full horror sank in. They weren't trying to cover up old crimes, they were setting him up to take the fall for new ones. When Detective Chen followed her investigation to its logical conclusion, she'd find Marcus in possession of all the evidence, painted as Ramon's partner rather than an accidental discoverer of his crimes. The files weren't just evidence of trafficking, they were proof of his supposed involvement in it. Every document he'd studied, every photograph he'd examined, every moment he'd spent trying to understand the scope of Ramon's operation had been building a case against himself. And tomorrow night, when he met them in the parking lot, they'd probably have Detective Chen waiting in that SUV instead of the threats they'd promised. Marcus sank into a chair and stared at his sleeping daughter, understanding finally that he'd already lost. The network hadn't spent decades perfecting their operation, only to be brought down by an unemployed machinist with a conscience. They'd simply found a new use for him, the perfect patsy to close their books forever. In 8 hours, his choice would be between prison and death. Either way, Sophia would wake up without a father. All seemed lost. Marcus sat motionless in the darkness, Detective Chen's report heavy in his hands like a death sentence. The words blurred together as exhaustion and despair clouded his vision, but one detail suddenly snapped into sharp focus. The surveillance dates listed in the report were all wrong. According to Chen's investigation, Marcus had been observed watching the storage facility for weeks before Ramon's death. But Ramon had died 3 months ago, and Marcus had only learned about the auction 2 days before it happened. He grabbed his phone and checked the date. The timestamps in the police report claimed surveillance footage of him from dates when he'd been working double shifts at the temporary agency, desperately trying to save money for Sophia's Christmas. His hands shaking, Marcus pulled out the storage unit receipt and compared it to the police report. The discrepancies weren't subtle. They were glaring contradictions that any competent defense attorney would spot immediately. Unless Chen wasn't looking for the truth. Unless she was part of the setup. But then Marcus noticed something else that made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the police report, almost hidden in the administrative details, was a case number that looked familiar. He rifled through the files until he found his own missing person report from 1996, the one his adoptive parents had claimed never existed. The case numbers were sequential. Marcus stared at the 2 documents, his mind racing through implications that seemed impossible. Chen wasn't investigating old crimes, she was investigating the same case, the same network, the same operation that had stolen him 27 years ago. Ramon's death hadn't created a new problem, it had reopened an old wound that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. He grabbed his laptop and searched for Detective Sarah Chen, expecting to find a corrupt cop in the network's pocket. Instead, he found something that changed everything. Newspaper articles about Chen's 15-year crusade to find her missing brother David, her transition from victim's family member to police detective, her repeated attempts to reopen cold cases that her superiors had closed without investigation. David Chen, the name from one of the files. Marcus frantically pulled out David's folder and found the photograph he'd studied earlier. A 7-year-old boy with gap teeth and hopeful eyes. The boy who'd disappeared in 2008 and been placed with a loving family in Oregon under the name Daniel Park. The sister who'd never stopped looking for him had grown up to become Detective Sarah Chen. The revelation hit him like lightning. Chen wasn't part of the conspiracy. She was the threat they were trying to neutralize. Her investigation into Ramon's death was getting too close to the truth, and they needed someone to take the fall before she exposed the entire network. Marcus wasn't just being framed for Ramon's crimes, he was being used to discredit the one person who might actually solve them. But that meant the surveillance dates in the police report weren't just wrong, they were deliberately falsified. Someone with access to police systems had been feeding Chen false information, steering her investigation toward Marcus while protecting the real perpetrators. The network had people inside law enforcement, but Chen herself was clean. Marcus's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. The storage unit auction hadn't been random. It had been timed to coincide with Chen's investigation. They'd needed someone to discover the evidence before Chen did, someone they could control and manipulate and ultimately sacrifice. An unemployed single father with a criminal record and financial desperation was perfect, sympathetic enough to gain access to the files, vulnerable enough to be manipulated, and expendable enough to be thrown away when his usefulness ended. But they'd made a mistake. They'd assumed Marcus would be too desperate or too stupid to notice the inconsistencies in their setup. They'd counted on him being overwhelmed by the scope of the crimes and the threats to his daughter. They'd never expected him to start connecting dots instead of simply following their script. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at Detective Chen's contact information from the police report. If he was right, if she was legitimately investigating instead of covering up, then she might be his only ally. But contacting her would mean crossing a line he couldn't uncross, gambling Sophia's safety on his ability to read the intentions of a stranger. He thought about David Chen, wherever he was now, living under the name Daniel Park, and unaware that his sister had spent 15 years searching for him about Isabella Santos and Christina Park and Timothy Rodriguez, all the stolen children who'd grown up believing comfortable lies about their origins, about his own adoptive parents, who died never knowing the truth about where their son had really come from. The network was counting on that comfort, that willingness to choose pleasant fiction over difficult truth. They'd built their entire operation on the assumption that people would rather not know, would rather not fight, would rather not risk what they had for the sake of what they'd lost. But sitting in his dark apartment, surrounded by evidence of decades of stolen childhoods, Marcus realized that assumption was their weakness, because some truths were worth fighting for, even when fighting meant losing everything. He picked up his phone and started typing a message to Detective Chen. Detective Chen, this is Marcus Rivera. I have information about your brother David and the Ramon Delgado case. Meet me at Panorama Park tomorrow at 6 a.m. Come alone and bring nothing electronic. They're watching both of us. Marcus stared at the message for 5 minutes before hitting send. The moment his phone confirmed delivery, he felt something shift inside him, not relief, but a crystalline clarity that came from finally choosing action over paralysis. He was no longer just reacting to their moves, he was making his own. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of careful preparation. Marcus photographed every document with his phone, uploaded them to a cloud storage account he created using Sophia's school email, and printed copies on his ancient inkjet printer that wheezed through each page like it was dying. He sealed the originals in plastic bags and distributed them throughout the apartment. Some taped under kitchen drawers, others hidden inside Sophia's toy boxes, one set wrapped in garbage bags and stuffed into the tank of their toilet. If they searched the apartment, they'd find evidence. If they took him, the evidence would survive. If they killed him, someone would eventually piece together the truth. By 5 a.m., Marcus had consumed enough coffee to power a small city. He'd also made peace with the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. The network had spent decades perfecting their operation, had people inside law enforcement, had resources and connections he couldn't even imagine. He was an unemployed machinist with a high school education and $300 in his checking account. But he had something they'd never counted on, nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Marcus kissed Sophia's forehead as she slept, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep about being home when she woke up. Mrs. Rodriguez next door had agreed to watch her, a kindness that stabbed at his heart because it might be the last favor he'd ever need to ask. Panorama Park at dawn was exactly what Marcus had hoped for, empty except for a few joggers, multiple exit routes, and enough open space to spot surveillance from any direction. He'd chosen the playground because it gave him cover behind the climbing structure while providing clear sight lines to the parking areas. Detective Chen arrived precisely at 6 a.m. in an unmarked sedan that had seen better decades. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4" with graying hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, but she moved with the careful alertness of someone who'd learned not to trust her surroundings. Her eyes swept the park methodically before settling on Marcus, with an intensity that made him feel like he was being scanned by some kind of human metal detector. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said without preamble, settling onto the bench beside him, but maintaining enough distance to react if he proved dangerous. "Probably both." "Definitely both," Marcus agreed. He handed her David's file, just that one, as a test of her intentions. "Your brother is alive. He's living in Portland under the name Daniel Park, and he has no idea you've been looking for him." Chen's composure cracked like ice under pressure. She stared at the photograph of 7-year-old David with shaking hands, then at the documents detailing his placement with the Park family, her professional mask dissolving into raw grief and desperate hope. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Ramon Delgado's storage unit, along with files on 43 other children who were trafficked between 2008 and 2019. Marcus watched her face carefully, looking for any sign that she was performing surprise rather than experiencing it, including myself. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus laid out everything he'd discovered, while Chen absorbed each revelation with the focused intensity of someone who'd waited 15 years for answers. She asked sharp questions about dates and locations, cross-referencing his information against details from her own investigation that had never been made public. Her genuine shock at learning the scope of the operation convinced Marcus that his gamble had been correct. Chen was hunting the network, not protecting it. "They're setting us both up," Marcus concluded, showing her the falsified police report with his name on it. "Someone inside your department has been feeding you false information to steer your investigation toward me. Tonight at midnight they want me to meet them in a parking lot to discuss terms. But I think they're planning to have you arrest me there with all the evidence in my possession." Chen studied the documents with the grim satisfaction of someone whose paranoid suspicions had finally been validated. "I knew something was wrong with the surveillance reports. The timestamps never quite added up, and the quality was too poor for our usual equipment." She looked up at Marcus with something approaching respect. "You figured this out faster than I expected anyone could." "Desperation makes you smart," Marcus said. "The question is, what do we do now?" For the first time since arriving, Detective Chen smiled, a predatory expression that suggested she'd been waiting her entire career for exactly this opportunity. "Now we set a trap of our own." Marcus felt the weight of 15 years settle on his shoulders as Detective Chen's smile faded into something harder, more determined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the playground equipment, and he realized there would be no going back to his old life after this moment. Sophia would wake up in a few hours to a world where her father was either a hero or a fugitive, but no longer just an unemployed machinist scraping by. "The midnight meeting," Chen said, pulling out a worn notebook. "Where exactly?" "Walmart parking lot on Rosedale Highway. They want me to bring everything. All the files, all the evidence." Marcus watched her scribble notes in handwriting that looked like controlled chaos. "I think the plan is for you to show up just as I'm handing over the documents, making it look like I was trying to sell them or dispose of evidence." "Probably." Chen flipped through pages of what Marcus now recognized as years of careful documentation. "I've been getting anonymous tips for months, all leading me towards storage facilities and known associates of Ramon Delgado. Someone's been playing a long game, building a narrative where you're the missing link in their cold case." The implications made Marcus's stomach clench. "How long have they been planning this?" "Since Ramon died, maybe longer." Chen's expression darkened. Ramon wasn't just a drug dealer who happened to traffic children on the side. He was keeping records as insurance, probably planning to expose the network if they ever tried to eliminate him. When he died in prison, and I'm increasingly convinced that wasn't natural causes, someone needed to control the narrative about what he might have left behind. Marcus thought about the meticulous organization of the files, the careful documentation of each child's journey from abduction to placement. He was building a case against them. "And now we're going to finish it." Chen closed her notebook and looked directly at Marcus. "But you need to understand what you're committing to. These people have been operating for decades. They have resources, connections, people in positions of power who've been protecting this network since before you were born. If we do this, if we really go after them, there's no guarantee we'll survive long enough to see justice." The weight of her words settled over the empty playground like fog. Marcus thought about Sophia, probably just waking up, wondering where her dad had gone so early. About Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd agreed to watch her without asking questions. About the comfortable life they'd built in their small apartment, modest and struggling but safe. "What happens to my daughter if this goes wrong?" Chen's expression softened slightly. "I have friends outside the department, people I trust. If something happens to us, they'll make sure Sophia is protected and that the evidence reaches the right people." She paused. "But I won't lie to you, Marcus. The safest thing for both of you would be to walk away right now. Burn the files, forget what you found, go back to your life." Marcus almost laughed at the impossibility of it. "You think I haven't considered that? You think I haven't spent every moment since I opened that storage unit wishing I'd just bought someone else's junk and gone home? But you can't," Chen said quietly, "because now you know. Because now I know." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the photograph he'd taken of David's file. "Your brother is 22 years old. He's studying engineering at Portland State University. He thinks his parents died in a car accident when he was 7, and he has no memory of ever having a sister." Chen's hands trembled as she stared at the image. "He's alive. He's alive, and so are 42 other kids who grew up thinking they were orphans or that their families didn't want them." Marcus felt something crystallize in his chest, a resolve that had been building since the moment he'd found his own missing person report. "They stole our childhoods, Chen. They stole our families. They stole our ability to choose who we wanted to become. And they're still doing it," Chen added grimly. "This network didn't just disappear when Ramon died. They evolved, adapted. There are probably other storage units, other record keepers, other children being processed right now while we sit here talking." The morning joggers had been replaced by early dog walkers, normal people living normal lives, unaware that their world contained such systematic horror. Marcus envied them their ignorance, but he could never return to it. "So, what's the plan?" he asked. Chen's predatory smile returned. "We give them exactly what they want. You show up at midnight with all the evidence, ready to make a deal. I'll be there too, right on schedule, playing my part as the investigating detective who's finally caught her suspect. And then we spring our trap and hope we're smart enough to survive what comes next." Chen stood and extended her hand. "Are you ready to finish what Ramon started?" Marcus gripped her hand, feeling the calluses of someone who'd spent 15 years fighting for justice. "I've been ready since I was 7 years old. I just didn't know it yet." The 12 hours between dawn and midnight stretched like an eternity. Each minute weighted with the knowledge that Marcus was walking toward either redemption or destruction. He spent the morning creating what he grimly thought of as his insurance policy, detailed letters explaining everything he'd discovered, addressed to journalists, federal investigators, and victims' rights organizations. If the night went wrong, if he disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, at least the truth would eventually surface. By noon, Marcus had transformed his apartment into a fortress of evidence. Every surface held carefully arranged documents, each photographed and catalogued with obsessive precision. He'd learned this methodology from Ramon's files themselves, the drug dealer's meticulous record, keeping now serving as a template for exposing the very network Ramon had documented. Sophia returned from school to find her father unusually attentive, asking detailed questions about her day, her friends, her dreams for the future. She seemed to sense something momentous happening beneath his forced normalcy, clinging to him longer than usual when he tucked her into bed. "Daddy, are you going somewhere?" she asked, her 8-year-old intuition cutting through his careful performance. Marcus smoothed her hair, memorizing the weight of her head against his chest. "Just taking care of some important business, sweetheart. Mrs. Rodriguez is going to stay here tonight, just in case I'm late coming home. Is it about the storage unit? The one that was supposed to help with Christmas?" The innocent question nearly broke his resolve. Sophia still believed the storage unit had been about finding treasures to sell, about making their Christmas special despite their financial struggles. She had no idea her father had stumbled into a conspiracy that stretched back to his own stolen childhood. In a way, Marcus said carefully, sometimes when you're looking for one thing, you find something completely different, something more important than what you were originally searching for. Sophia nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Like when I was looking for my favorite crayon but found the earring you lost instead. Exactly like that. Marcus kissed her forehead, wondering if this would be their last normal moment together. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and I love you more than all the fish in the ocean, she replied, completing their nightly ritual. At 10 p.m., Marcus began his final preparations. He'd spent hours deciding which documents to bring and which to leave hidden throughout the apartment. The originals of the most damning evidence would stay behind, insurance against his potential disappearance. But he needed to bring enough authentic material to make the setup convincing while keeping copies of everything for Chen's investigation. The files he selected told a story that went far beyond Ramon's individual crimes. Birth certificates that had been altered with professional precision, social security numbers that belonged to children who'd officially died years earlier, photographs of happy families that Marcus now recognized as staged documentation of successful placements, and threading through it all, a financial network that moved money through legitimate charities and adoption agencies, turning stolen children into profitable transactions. Marcus understood now why the network had been so desperate to control this evidence. Ramon hadn't just been keeping records, he'd been mapping their entire operation, documenting connections that reached into law enforcement, social services, and family court systems. The files revealed not just individual crimes, but institutional corruption on a scale that would destroy careers and topple organizations if it ever became public. At 11:30 p.m., Marcus loaded the carefully selected documents into a gym bag and walked to his car. The November air bit at his skin, carrying the smell of approaching rain and the faint chemical tang that seemed to follow him everywhere since opening that storage unit. Bakersfield at night looked different now that he understood what lurked beneath its ordinary surface. Every anonymous building potentially hiding secrets, every official vehicle potentially carrying enemies instead of protectors. The drive to the Walmart parking lot took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Marcus's mind cycled through every possible outcome, from successful exposure of the network to his own death in what would undoubtedly be staged as a criminal transaction gone wrong. He thought about Detective Chen, positioned somewhere in the shadows with her own backup plans and contingencies. About Sophia, sleeping peacefully under Mrs. Rodriguez's protection. About David Chen, studying engineering in Portland with no knowledge that his sister had never stopped searching for him. As Marcus pulled into the vast, mostly empty parking lot, he realized that everything in his life had been leading to this moment. The storage unit auction, the financial desperation that had driven him there, even his own stolen childhood, all of it had converged into this single point where truth would either triumph or be buried forever. He parked near the designated meeting spot and checked his watch, 11:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, he would discover whether 15 years of Detective Chen's investigation and 27 years of his own unknowing preparation would be enough to bring down a network that had stolen the childhoods of dozens of innocent victims. The ultimate test was about to begin. At exactly midnight, a black sedan glided into the parking lot like a predator emerging from darkness. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather as 2 figures stepped out of the vehicle. The first was Detective Martinez, the same Martinez whose name appeared on dozens of falsified reports throughout Ramon's files. The second figure made Marcus's blood freeze, Assistant District Attorney Catherine Voss, a woman whose face he'd seen on local news broadcasts accepting awards for her work protecting children. They approached his car with the measured confidence of people accustomed to controlling every situation. Martinez's hand rested casually on his weapon, while Voss carried herself with the cold authority of someone who'd spent decades hiding behind a facade of public service. "Mr. Rivera," Voss called out, her voice cutting through the night air, "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Marcus stepped out slowly, the gym bag heavy in his grip. Belongs to you? These are records of kidnapped children, not lost property. Martinez laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. Kidnapped is such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as relocation services, taking children from unstable situations and placing them with families who could provide better opportunities. You provided better opportunities for me? Marcus's voice carried 27 years of suppressed rage. By erasing my identity? By making me disappear? You turned out fine, Voss said dismissively. Good family, decent upbringing. You should be grateful instead of causing problems. The casual cruelty of her words ignited something primal in Marcus's chest. Grateful? I spent my entire childhood wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own life. My daughter asks me about her grandparents, and I have to lie because I don't even know who I really am. Your daughter, Martinez said softly, and the implied threat in his tone made Marcus's vision blur with fury. Sofia Rivera, age 8, attends Franklin Elementary, walks home past the playground on Maple Street every Tuesday and Thursday. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. They knew about Sofia, had probably been watching her, cataloguing her routines, preparing contingencies. His hands shook as he realized the true scope of their power. These weren't just criminals, they were pillars of the community with access to school records, police reports, child protective services. You stay away from her, Marcus growled, taking a step forward. That depends entirely on your cooperation, Voss replied coolly. Those files contain sensitive information about ongoing investigations, national security implications. Surely you understand why they can't become public. National security? Marcus almost laughed at the audacity. You're trafficking children and you want to wrap it in patriotism? We're managing a complex problem, Martinez interjected. Do you have any idea how many children disappear into the system every year? How many would end up dead or worse without our intervention? We provide solutions. You provide profit margins, Marcus shot back. Ramon's files show the money trail, 50,000 per placement split between adoption agencies, court officials, and whoever handles the documentation cleanup. He saw something flicker in Voss's eyes, surprised that he'd understood the financial scope, or perhaps calculation about whether he'd shared this information with others. Ramon was always too detailed in his record-keeping, she said finally, a character flaw that ultimately led to his unfortunate death in prison. The admission hung in the air like a confession. They'd killed Ramon to protect their network, just as they were prepared to kill Marcus now. Here's what's going to happen, Martinez said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. You're going to give us every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence you found. In return, you get to go home to your daughter and pretend none of this ever happened. And if I refuse, then Detective Chen will discover your body tomorrow morning during what appears to be a drug deal gone wrong, Voss explained with chilling matter-of-factness. The same Detective Chen who's been feeding us information about her investigation for the past 6 months, thinking she was building a case against you. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Chen was compromised? Everything they'd planned. Oh yes, Voss continued, reading his expression. We know all about your touching reunion this morning. Chen has been very useful in identifying potential threats to our operation, including you. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Marcus noticed something that gave him hope. A shadow moving near the store's loading dock, too deliberate to be a random pedestrian. Chen had mentioned backup plans, contingencies that went beyond their official arrangement. You made one mistake, Marcus said, pulling the gym bag closer to his chest. And what's that? Martinez asked. You assumed I was stupid enough to trust anyone completely. Marcus smiled grimly. These aren't the only copies. The sound of screeching tires suddenly filled the parking lot as unmarked vehicles surrounded them from 3 directions. Federal agents spilling out with weapons drawn. But in the chaos that followed, Marcus realized with growing horror that he couldn't tell who was there to save him and who was there to ensure his silence forever. The federal agents moved with military precision, their weapons trained on everyone in the parking lot. Marcus found himself caught in the center of a standoff where he couldn't distinguish allies from enemies, where every badge and uniform might represent either salvation or execution. FBI! Nobody move! The lead agent's voice cut through the night, but Marcus noticed Martinez didn't seem surprised by their arrival. If anything, the corrupt detective looked relieved. "Agent Morrison," Voss called out calmly, adjusting her coat as if federal raids were routine social events. "Right on schedule." Marcus's heart plummeted. Even the FBI response was compromised. The network's reach extended far deeper than he'd imagined, tendrils of corruption wrapping around every institution that should have protected children like him. But then, from behind the federal vehicles, Detective Chen emerged with a smaller team. Men and women who moved differently. Their weapons aimed not at Marcus, but at the agents surrounding him. "Internal Affairs," Chen announced, her badge held high. "Agent Morrison, you're under investigation for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." The parking lot exploded into chaos. Morrison's team wheeled toward Chen's officers while Martinez drew his weapon, no longer pretending to be anything but a cornered predator. Voss backed toward her sedan, her composure finally cracking as she realized the trap had multiple layers. "Marcus!" Chen shouted across the battlefield. "The documents! They can't get the documents!" In that moment, Marcus understood the true cost of victory. The gym bag in his hands contained the only physical evidence capable of destroying the network, but it also represented his daughter's safety. If he gave up the documents, these people would disappear into the shadows, regroup, and continue stealing children while Sophia lived under constant threat. If he kept them, he might not survive the night to protect her himself. Time slowed as Marcus made his choice. He sprinted toward Chen's position, clutching the bag that held 15 years of Ramon's meticulous documentation. Gunfire erupted behind him, Morrison's corrupted agents firing at Chen's team while Martinez pursued Marcus with murderous determination. A bullet shattered the asphalt inches from Marcus's feet. Another punched through a parked car's windshield, sending glass cascading across the pavement. But Marcus kept running, driven by the knowledge that dozens of stolen children were counting on his survival, including the 7-year-old boy he'd once been. "The backup files!" Chen yelled, as Marcus dove behind her team's defensive position. "Where are they?" "My apartment," Marcus gasped. Sophia's bedroom, hidden in her bookshelf. Chen's expression turned grim. "They'll figure that out. Morrison has been feeding them intelligence for months." Another volley of gunfire forced them deeper into cover. Marcus could see Martinez flanking their position while Voss spoke rapidly into her phone, calling for more corrupted reinforcements, or perhaps arranging Sophia's immediate abduction. "We need to get you out of here," Chen said. "If you die, this all dies with you." "What about the evidence?" Marcus clutched the gym bag tighter. "What about your brother?" "David will have to wait." Chen's voice carried 15 years of accumulated pain. "But if we don't survive this, he'll never know the truth anyway." The sacrifice crystallized before Marcus like a physical weight. To save the children, he had to abandon his own child's safety. To protect Sophia, he had to let the network escape with their secrets intact. There was no path forward that didn't require losing something precious. But then Marcus remembered Ramon's final strategy, the drug dealer's ultimate insurance policy hidden in the files themselves. Every document contained digital watermarks, embedded codes that traced back to a secure server Ramon had established before his death. The physical evidence was crucial, but it wasn't the only weapon they possessed. "Chen," Marcus said urgently. Ramon embedded everything in a digital archive, locations in his personal journal, the one in evidence lockup. Understanding flashed across Chen's face. The journal Morrison claimed was destroyed. It was never destroyed. Ramon was too paranoid for that. Marcus smiled grimly as more bullets whined overhead. He hid it in the last place anyone would look, filed under evidence for a routine drug bust, case number buried in thousands of similar arrests. Chen keyed her radio. "This is Chen. I need immediate backup at police evidence storage. Suspect attempt to destroy critical evidence in progress. Across the parking lot, Marcus could see Morrison speaking frantically into his own radio, trying to coordinate the evidence destruction before Chen's people could reach it. The corrupted FBI agent was trapped between fighting the current battle and protecting the network's future. But victory would still require sacrifice. Marcus looked at the gym bag in his hands, his only guaranteed proof, his daughter's safety, his own leverage for survival. Without hesitation, he hurled the bag toward the burning wreckage of a police car. "Marcus, no!" Chen screamed. The bag hit the flames and ignited instantly. 15 years of Ramon's careful documentation curled into ash and smoke, taking with it any hope of easy justice. But as the evidence burned, Marcus felt something unexpected. Not despair, but liberation. The real fight was just beginning. The gunfire gradually subsided into an eerie silence, broken only by the crackling flames consuming Ramon's files. Marcus watched the bag burn, each curl of smoke carrying away photographs of stolen children, falsified documents, and financial records that could have toppled the entire network. But instead of the crushing despair he'd expected, he felt something unexpected settling in his chest, a strange peace born from finally choosing truth over survival. Detective Chen's radio crackled to life. "Chen, this is Rodriguez at Evidence Storage. We've got it. The journal's intact. Morrison's people tried to breach the facility, but we intercepted them." Across the parking lot, Agent Morrison's face contorted with rage as he realized his network's carefully constructed protection was crumbling. Martinez lay motionless near an overturned police car, his weapons scattered across the asphalt. Catherine Voss sat handcuffed in the back of an internal affairs vehicle, her decades of public service awards meaningless now against the weight of documented corruption. "The digital archive," Chen said breathlessly, lowering her weapon as more IA vehicles surrounded the remaining corrupted agents. "Marcus, do you understand what this means?" Ramon backed up everything. Every transaction, every falsified report, every stolen child. Marcus nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. The immediate battle was over, but the war would continue in courtrooms and congressional hearings for years to come. "How many?" he asked quietly. "How many children?" "According to the preliminary data, Rodriguez is sending me—" Chen paused, reading her phone with growing amazement. 147 documented cases over 15 years. Some aged out of the system, some adopted by unwitting families, others— She trailed off, unable to finish. "Others, like me," Marcus completed. "Living entire lives wondering why we never felt like we belonged." The weight of those numbers settled over them both. 147 stolen childhoods, scattered across the country like seeds of trauma, each one representing families destroyed and identities erased. Marcus thought of his own adoptive parents. Were they innocent victims who'd unknowingly participated in trafficking, or willing conspirators who'd built their family on a foundation of lies? "There's going to be chaos," Chen said, watching as more federal vehicles arrived, legitimate agents this time, called in by internal affairs. Trials, investigations, congressional committees. Some of these kids are adults now with families of their own. Others are still out there, still living under false identities. "What about Sophia?" Marcus asked, the question that had been gnawing at him throughout the entire confrontation. "When this becomes public, when my real identity comes out, she'll need counseling. You both will." Chen's voice carried hard-earned wisdom. "But Marcus, she'll still be your daughter. Blood doesn't make family, love does." Marcus understood the truth of her words, but he also knew the practical challenges ahead. Legal battles over his custody rights when his identity was proven false. Sophia's confusion and potential resentment when she learned her father wasn't who she'd believed him to be. The media attention, the court proceedings, the years of testimony required to dismantle a network this extensive. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Sophia asking for you. Everything okay?" "Everything okay." Marcus almost laughed at the impossibility of that question. In one night, he discovered his entire life was built on lies, destroyed evidence worth millions of dollars, and triggered investigations that would reshape multiple government agencies. But looking at that simple text, knowing his daughter was safe and waiting for him, Marcus realized that some definitions of okay ran deeper than legal documents or biological truth. "I need to go home," he said, pocketing the phone. "Sophia doesn't know about any of this yet, and I want to tell her myself before she hears it somewhere else." Chen nodded understandingly. "The investigators will want to debrief you tomorrow, but tonight you're just a father going home to his daughter." As Marcus walked toward his car, stepping carefully around shattered glass and evidence markers, he felt the November air differently than he had hours earlier. The chemical tang was gone, replaced by the clean scent of approaching rain. Bakersfield looked the same, anonymous buildings and empty streets stretching toward the Sierra Nevada. But Marcus knew he'd never see his hometown the same way again. The drive home took longer than usual as he navigated around emergency vehicles and police barricades. But when he finally pulled into his apartment complex, Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting on her porch with Sophia curled against her shoulder, both of them wrapped in a thick blanket. "Daddy!" Sophia ran to him with the uncomplicated joy of a child who trusted that her father would always come home. Marcus caught her in his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling her solid warmth against his chest. Tomorrow would bring impossible conversations and painful revelations, but tonight, holding his daughter under the stars they'd counted together since she was 3 years old, Marcus knew that some truths were stronger than lies, some bonds deeper than blood. The real healing could finally begin. The return. Marcus carried Sophia inside their apartment, a sleepy weight familiar against his shoulder as he navigated the cramped hallway that had never felt more precious. Mrs. Rodriguez followed quietly, her weathered hands smoothing Sophia's hair with the tenderness of someone who understood that ordinary moments could shatter without warning. "She waited up as long as she could," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered as Marcus settled Sophia onto the couch. "Kept asking when you'd be home from your important meeting. I told her you were helping people, which seemed to satisfy her." Marcus looked around their small living room, the mismatched furniture, Sophia's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the pile of library books they'd been reading together, and felt a profound shift in his perception. 3 weeks ago, this apartment had represented failure, a cramped reminder of everything he couldn't provide for his daughter. Now it felt like sanctuary, every worn surface proof that they'd built something real despite the lies surrounding his identity. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Rodriguez, meaning far more than just the babysitting, "for everything." She squeezed his arm with surprising strength. "That little girl loves you, Marcus, whatever trouble you're dealing with. Remember that love doesn't care about paperwork." After she left, Marcus sat beside Sophia on the couch, watching her sleep and trying to imagine how to explain that her father wasn't who she thought he was. At 8 years old, she barely understood adoption in the abstract. How could he make her comprehend that his entire identity was a carefully constructed lie? His phone buzzed with messages throughout the night. Updates from Detective Chen about arrests and seizures across 3 states. A voicemail from a victim's rights advocate explaining the legal support available for recovered trafficking survivors. An email from a journalist who'd somehow already gotten wind of the story, requesting an interview about his heroic actions. Heroic. Marcus deleted the message without reading further. Heroes didn't spend 15 years living a stolen life, while other children remained trapped in the same system. Heroes didn't have to be told by strangers what their real names were. Sophia stirred as dawn light filtered through their thin curtains. "Daddy? You smell different?" Marcus realized he still carried traces of smoke and cordite from the parking lot confrontation. "I need a shower, sweetheart, but first we should talk." "About the storage unit?" Sophia asked, instantly alert. "Did you find treasure?" The innocence of her question nearly broke his heart. In a way, he had found treasure, the truth about his identity, justice for dozens of stolen children, evidence to dismantle a trafficking network. But the cost of that treasure was Sophia's simple faith that her father's life made sense. "I found something important," he said carefully, "but it's complicated. Remember how we talked about how some families are born together and others are chosen together?" Sophia nodded, her dark eyes serious in the morning light. "Like me and you chose to keep me when Mommy got sick." "Exactly like that. Well, it turns out that your daddy was chosen too when he was little, only nobody told him the truth about it until now." Marcus watched Sophia process this information with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. She was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "Does that mean you have other parents somewhere?" "I might. I'm still trying to figure that out." Marcus pulled her closer. "But, Sophia, the most important thing you need to understand is that this doesn't change us. You're still my daughter, I'm still your daddy, and we're still a family, even if your name isn't really Marcus." The question hit him like a physical blow. Of course, she'd immediately grasped the implications. Sophia had always been frighteningly perceptive about adult complications. "My name might be different than what's on my birth certificate," he admitted. "But I've been Marcus Rivera, your father, for 8 years. That's who I am now, no matter what I was called before." Sophia considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Can I still call you Daddy?" "Always. Then I don't care what other people say your name is." The simple acceptance in her voice revealed something Marcus hadn't expected, that his daughter's love was more resilient than his fears. She didn't need him to be perfect or uncomplicated. She just needed him to be present, honest, and committed to their shared future. His phone rang, interrupting the moment. Detective Chen's number appeared on the screen. "We found your birth family," Chen said without preamble when he answered. "Your real name is Michael Santos. Your parents live in Sacramento. They never stopped looking for you." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the final pieces of his stolen childhood clicking into place. Michael Santos. The name felt foreign and familiar simultaneously, like a song he'd hummed without knowing the lyrics. "Do they want to meet me?" he asked. "They want to meet both of you," Chen replied gently. "They know about Sophia. They want to know their son and their granddaughter." Marcus looked at Sophia, who was watching him with patient curiosity. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more adjustments, more healing, but tonight they were home, the new beginning. 3 months later, Michael, stood in the kitchen of a house he was still learning to call home, watching Sophia help her grandmother make tamales for Sunday dinner. The Sacramento suburb felt nothing like Bakersfield's dusty sprawl, but the warmth in his parents' voices when they called Sophia Mija had begun healing wounds he hadn't known existed. "She has your stubborn streak," his mother, Elena, said softly, joining him by the window. "Even at 7, you insisted on doing everything yourself." Marcus smiled, though the reference to his stolen childhood still stung. "I don't remember that." "You will," Elena said with quiet confidence. "Not everything, but the important pieces. Love has a way of rebuilding what trauma breaks." The investigation had concluded 2 weeks ago with 47 arrests across 12 states. Agent Morrison would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Catherine Voss had taken a plea deal in exchange for testimony that led to the recovery of 31 more children. Detective Chen had been promoted to head the new cross-state trafficking task force, though she still called Marcus weekly to check on their adjustment. Sophia burst into the kitchen, flour-covered hands raised in triumph. "Abuela says mine are the best she's ever seen from a beginner." Marcus knelt to her level, brushing flour from her cheek. "What do you think? Do you like cooking with Grandma? Can we live here forever?" Sophia asked, with the directness that still caught him off guard. "I like having a big family." The question they'd been dancing around for months finally hung in the open air. Marcus glanced at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. They'd discussed this possibility extensively, his parents offering to help with Sophia's education, their desire to rebuild lost time, the job opportunities in Sacramento's growing manufacturing sector. Would you want that? Marcus asked Sophia. Even if it means leaving Bakersfield, Mrs. Rodriguez? Your school? Sophia considered this with characteristic seriousness. Mrs. Rodriguez said families grow when people choose love over fear. She said she'd visit us wherever we were happy. The wisdom of an 8-year-old, filtered through their elderly neighbor's experience, crystallized everything Marcus had been struggling to articulate. For months, he'd been paralyzed by the fear that changing their lives would somehow invalidate the family they'd built together. But Sophia understood what he was only beginning to grasp, that honoring their past didn't require limiting their future. His phone buzzed with a text from Chen. Official word came through today. Your legal name change is approved. Birth certificate will read Marcus Michael Santos Rivera. You get to keep all the pieces of yourself. Marcus stared at the message, feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless since November. Marcus Michael Santos Rivera. The name contained his stolen childhood and chosen fatherhood, his birth family's heritage and Sophia's surname, the identity he'd lost and the man he'd become. Daddy? Sophia tugged his sleeve. You're crying. Happy tears, he said, lifting her into his arms. I just got some good news about our names. Our names are staying together forever. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see his father, Carlos, teaching Sophia's bike-riding techniques in the backyard, the grandfather she'd never expected, and the patience Marcus was slowly remembering. The storage unit that had started this journey was long since cleaned and rented to someone else, but the children's files it contained had led to the largest trafficking conviction in California history. Most importantly, it had led them here. Elena returned to the kitchen carrying a photo album Marcus had been avoiding for weeks. I want to show you something, she said gently, opening to a page of pictures from his 7th birthday, the last one before he disappeared. The little boy in the photos looked exactly like Sophia when she concentrated on puzzles. Same furrowed brow, same determined chin, same spark of intelligence in dark eyes. But seeing his child self surrounded by family, aunts and uncles and cousins whose names were slowly returning to him, Marcus finally understood what he'd been mourning all these years. Not just his identity, but his sense of belonging to something larger than survival. We never stopped setting a place for you at Christmas dinner, Elena said quietly. Even when people told us to move on, we knew you'd come home eventually. Sophia wiggled out of his arms to study the photos more closely. Daddy, you were smaller than me. Much smaller, Marcus agreed, his voice thick with emotion. But I had a family who loved me just like you do. As the afternoon sun slanted through windows that were beginning to feel familiar, Marcus realized that healing didn't require forgetting the pain or pretending the stolen years hadn't mattered. It required choosing to believe that love could rebuild what trauma had broken, that families could expand to hold complicated truths, that home was not a place but a decision to stop running from the possibility of belonging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more adjustments, continued therapy for both of them. But tonight, they would fall asleep in a house full of people who had chosen to love them, not despite their complicated story, but because of it. The boy who had been stolen could finally rest. The man who had been found was home,